Moses Bell had buried settlers before. He knew what a quiet cabin meant in winter, knew the particular stillness of a place where the cold had finished what the storm had started. He waded through the drift to the door. Snow had packed 3 feet against the boards. No tracks led in or out. The chimney stood bare against a white sky, producing nothing. No smoke, no shimmer, nothing. He brushed the ice from the latch and pressed his ear to the wood. From inside, so faint he almost missed it beneath the wind, a child coughed. Torgrim Vangen had not planned to be alone. No one ever does. He had come to Dakota territory in the spring of 1879 with his wife Ragna and his brother's boy Kittle, who was 8 then and already knew how to split kindling without being asked. They had filed on 160 acres 12 miles west of Sioux Falls, paid the $18 filing fee with money Torgrim had earned firing brick at a kiln outside Minneapolis, and staked their future on a quarter section of treeless grass along Skunk Creek. The cabin went up fast because Torgrim understood walls. 12 by 16 feet, half rough-sawn board hauled from the Sioux Falls mill, half sod chinking packed into the gaps where the lumber ran short. He nailed tar paper over the north face because the wind came from the north, and the boards on that side had already started to warp. Ragna died in April of 1880. Fever. She went from standing at the stove to lying on the bed in 2 days, and from lying on the bed to the churchyard in 3 more. Torgrim dug the grave himself because the ground had just thawed enough to accept a shovel. Marte was 6. She stood at the edge of the hole and did not cry, and that silence was worse than any sound Torgrim had ever heard. By summer he had 2 children, no wife, and a claim that required 5 years of continuous residence before the land became his. Walking away meant losing everything: the filing fee, the lumber, the 18 months of labor already sunk into sod and fence posts and a half-dug well. He had no relatives closer than Minnesota. He had no money for passage east. He had a daughter who needed feeding and a nephew who needed watching, and 160 acres of grass that did not care whether he lived or died. He took a threshing job in late September to earn cash for winter supplies. The plan was simple: finish the threshing, collect his wages, borrow Nils Haugen's ox team, and spend the last week of October cutting cottonwood from the river bottom along the Big Sioux, 6 miles east. Cottonwood burned fast and left little heat, but it was free and it was close, and a man with no money does not complain about the quality of what he can reach. The plan required one thing: that October behave like October. It did not. The storm arrived on the 15th of October, 1880, and it arrived like something personal. The sky went from gray to green to black in less than an hour. The wind came first, not the steady prairie wind that Torgrim had learned to ignore, but a screaming horizontal thing that flattened the grass and drove grit through every crack in the tar paper. Then the snow, not falling, flying, moving sideways so fast it stung exposed skin like thrown sand. The temperature dropped 30 degrees before dark. By morning, the road to Sioux Falls had vanished under drifts that buried fence posts to their caps. The creek froze solid in its bed. Nils Haugen's ox team, which Torgrim was supposed to borrow in 3 days, stood stranded at a farm 9 miles north, and no one was moving 9 miles in any direction. Torgrim stood in the doorway of his cabin and looked at his woodpile. 19 split bur oak billets, 37 cottonwood chunks, none bigger than a man's thigh, 2 sacks of twisted flax straw that Ragna had braided the previous autumn, before the fever, when she still had hands that moved without shaking, and a cracked cast-iron box stove with a 6-inch pipe that Torgrim had bought second-hand in Sioux Falls for $4 and hauled home in the back of a borrowed wagon. That was everything. That was what stood between his children and the cold. He did the math the way a man does math when the numbers are his children's lives. A Dakota winter, a real one, not the mild stretch they had stumbled through the year before, required 6 cords of seasoned hardwood for a family in a cabin this thin. 6 cords, stacked 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 48 feet long. He had less than a quarter cord. If he fed the stove at the rate it demanded, and the cast iron box demanded constantly, its cracked seams leaking heat like a sieve leaks water, he would burn through everything in 6 nights, maybe 7 if he kept the children in bed and let the cabin cool between feedings. If he damped the stove low to stretch the fuel, smoke spilled back through every crack and joint. The pipe clogged with creosote. The air turned gray and sharp. Kittle had already started coughing from the smoke of ordinary fires. Damping the stove would not save them. It would poison them slowly instead of freezing them quickly. 6 nights of heat. Then nothing. Marte pressed against his leg in the doorway, watching the snow, and said nothing. She had learned silence from her mother's grave. Moses Bell arrived on the 3rd day after the storm, when the wind had dropped enough to allow a man on horseback to navigate by fence line. Moses was 58, a former Army teamster who had driven supply wagons through Wyoming winters and now served as road overseer for the settlement. He had buried settlers. He had pulled frozen bodies from cabins that looked exactly like Torgrim's cabin, small, thin-walled, and quiet. When a cabin went quiet in January, Moses knew what the quiet meant. He did not knock. He pushed the door open with his shoulder because the latch had frozen, and he stood in the threshold with frost in his beard and looked at the wood pile and the stove and the 2 children sitting on the bed wrapped in every blanket Torgrim owned. Moses counted the billets. He counted the cottonwood chunks. He looked at the flax straw and dismissed it with a sound that was not quite a word. "You have maybe a cord and a half if you count the trash wood," Moses said. He was being generous. "You need 6. You might stretch to 5 if you bank the walls with sod and sleep in one bed, but you cannot stretch a quarter cord to 6. The numbers do not bend, Vangen." Torgrim said nothing. Moses walked to the stove and put his hand near the pipe. He pulled it back. "Your seams are cracked. You are losing heat through the iron before it reaches the air. How long does a full load last?" 4 hours, Torgrim said. "Maybe 5 if I close the damper." "And if you close the damper?" "Smoke." Moses nodded. He had heard this before. Every thin-walled cabin with a cheap stove told the same story. Open the damper, and the wood vanished. Close the damper, and the smoke came back. There was no position between those 2 failures that kept a family alive through January. "You cannot heat Dakota with a trick, Vangen," Moses said. "You heat it with cords." He looked at the children. Marte watched him from the bed with her mother's dark eyes. Kittle sat beside her, his hands cracked and red, holding a piece of kindling he had been whittling into something that might have been a horse. "Send the children to the Haugen place," Moses said. "Niels has room. His wife will take them. You stay here and burn what you have and pray someone gets a road open before the next blow." "If I send the children, I am telling the land office I cannot provide," Torgrim said. "They will say I have abandoned the claim." "If you keep the children, you are telling them they must freeze with you." Moses left. The hoofbeats faded into the white. The wind picked up again, pushing snow under the door in a thin line that crossed the floor like a scar. Torgrim fed the stove 2 cottonwood chunks and watched them catch. The fire roared for 20 minutes, filling the cabin with a heat that felt almost generous. Then the chunks burned down to coals, the iron cooled, and the cold crept back through every crack and seam as if the fire had never happened. He could feel the heat leaving, not gradually, but actively, as if something outside were pulling it through the walls. He closed the damper halfway. Smoke curled from the pipe joint and drifted across the ceiling in a gray sheet. Kittel coughed. Torgrim opened the damper again. The fire surged and the smoke cleared and the wood burned faster. Open meant heat that left. Closed meant smoke that stayed. The stove offered two choices, and both of them ended in the same place. He sat on the floor beside the stove and watched blue flame flicker above a split log. The flame danced over the surface of the wood, licking at the bark edge, curling upward in a thin ribbon that looked almost solid. Then it detached from the wood and rose into the pipe and vanished. That was fuel. He was watching fuel leave, not the wood. The wood was still there, glowing and cracking. The gas, the smoke, the invisible thing that rose from hot wood and carried heat with it. He was watching it climb into the pipe and disappear into the sky where it warmed nothing and no one. The memory came without warning, the way memories do when the body is cold and the mind is looking for something to hold. He was 9 years old, standing in his father's house in Telemark, a tiled stove, a kakelung, his father called it, borrowing the Swedish word because the Norwegian word for it was just the stove, and that did not capture what it was. White tiles, iron door, a chimney that rose through the center of the house. His father had let the fire go out hours ago, but when Torgrim pressed his palm to the tiles, they were still warm. Not hot, warm, the kind of warmth that enters through the skin and stays. His father opened a small soot door on the side of the stove and held a candle near the opening. The flame bent sideways, pulled by air moving through channels Torgrim could not see. Inside was a maze, baffles, turns, passages lined with soot and brick that forced the smoke to travel a long path before reaching the chimney. Every inch of that path was a surface that absorbed heat. The smoke entered hot and left cool. The brick entered cool and stayed warm for hours. "The fire is finished," his father had said. "The warmth is not." Torgrim had filed that memory the way children file things they do not yet need, without urgency, without understanding, the way a hand closes around a stone and drops it in a pocket. He had not thought about that stove in 20 years. Now he thought about it. He looked at the cast iron box stove with its cracked seams and its 6-inch pipe running straight to the roof. Iron heated fast and cooled fast. The pipe carried everything, heat, smoke, unburned gas, directly out of the cabin in a single straight path. There were no turns, no channels, no mass to hold anything. The stove was a machine for converting wood into momentary heat and permanent loss. What if the path were longer? What if the smoke had to travel, had to turn, had to give up its heat to something heavy before it left? What if the fire burned hot and fast, fierce enough to ignite the gas itself, and then the heat went into stone instead of sky? He did not know the words for what he was thinking. He did not know that combustion engineers would later call it secondary burn, or that masonry heater builders would call it contraflow, or that the principle was as old as Roman hypocausts and Finnish soapstone stoves. He knew what his father's stove had done. He knew that brick held warmth and iron threw it away. He knew that smoke was wood that had not finished burning, and he knew that if he did nothing, his children would die in this cabin before Christmas. Torgrim pulled the stove away from the wall. The pipe disconnected with a screech of rust. Soot fell in a black curtain across the floor. Marte sat up on the bed and watched. Kittel stopped whittling. "What are you doing?" Kittel asked. "Something different," Torgrim said. He tilted the stove onto its side. The cracked seam ran along the bottom, a gap wide enough to fit a knife blade. The iron was thin, thinner than he had realized when he bought it. This stove had been cheap when it was new, and it was cheaper now. It had been designed to burn, not to hold. He needed brick. He needed clay. He needed stone heavy enough to absorb heat and hold it through a night. He needed a fire chamber narrow enough to force the flame hot and a path long enough to strip the heat before the smoke escaped. He had none of these things inside the cabin, but he had seen cracked firebrick at the abandoned lime kiln 2 miles south, scattered in the snow like broken teeth. He had clay at the creek bank, frozen now, but clay under ice is still clay. He had fieldstone in the foundation of Ragna's half-built root cellar, which he had never finished because she died before he could. And he had the cast iron stove door, which was the only piece of the entire stove worth keeping. He took a piece of charcoal from the firebox and a flour sack from the shelf, and he drew a narrow fire throat, 7 inches by 7 inches, lined with firebrick to hold the heat inside the combustion space. A vertical feed chamber above it, sized for split billets standing on end, not full logs lying flat. A horizontal burn tunnel where the flame would travel sideways through the hottest zone. Then a downward channel, the turn his father's stove had used, forcing the gases to reverse direction before entering the chimney path. The turn was everything. The turn was where the unburned gas met the hottest surface and finally ignited. And then, along the north wall where the cold came through the tar paper, an 8-foot stone bench, fieldstone and clay, packed solid, that the hot exhaust would travel through before finally reaching the chimney. By the time the gases left the cabin, they would have given up their heat to 1,000 pounds of stone. The stove would not burn for 18 hours. No fire did. But the stone would hold heat for 18 hours after the fire went out, the way his father's tiles had held warmth long after the flame was finished. One evening charge, a large oak billet and enough kindling to light it burned hot and clean and fast. Then the fire died, and the stone kept giving. Kittle looked at the drawing. "That is not a stove," he said. "No," Torgrim said. "It is not." Beret Lunda came the next afternoon, walking through the drifts with her boy on her hip and a bundle of hay twists under her arm. She was 38, widowed, the closest neighbor to the south, and she knew what fuel scarcity looked like because she lived inside it every winter. Her cabin was smaller than Torgrim's and her woodpile was larger, but neither fact made her comfortable. She burned hay twists when the wood ran low, and she knew exactly how fast they disappeared. A twist the size of a man's forearm lasted 8 minutes in a hot stove. 8 minutes. She had counted. She set the hay twists on the step and looked through the open door and saw the cast iron stove lying on its side with the pipe disconnected and the firebox empty. "What have you done?" Beret said. Torgrim showed her the drawing. Beret studied it. She was not an educated woman, but she had operated stoves her entire life, and she understood fire the way anyone understands a tool they depend on for survival. She traced the path with her finger, throat, tunnel, turn, bench, chimney, and stopped at the turn. "If the fire is fierce, it will eat faster," she said. "If it is slow, it will smoke. There is no third way." "There is," Torgrim said. "The third way is to let it eat fast and catch what it throws." "Catch it with what?" "Stone." Beret looked at the north wall with its tar paper and its gaps and its drafts. She looked at the children on the bed. She looked at the dismantled stove. "You have destroyed the only heat you had," she said, "to build something that does not exist." "It existed in Norway." "This is not Norway. This is Dakota, and your children cannot eat a drawing." She left the hay twists. She did not say goodbye. She said, "This is not agreement. This is for the children." Torgrim watched her walk south through the snow, her boy bouncing on her hip, and he felt the doubt in his own chest like a stone. Beret was not wrong. He had destroyed the conventional tool. He had nothing to replace it with except charcoal lines on a flour sack and a 20-year-old memory of his father's hand on warm tile. If he failed, the children would freeze faster than if he had done nothing at all. He twisted the first hay braid into the throat of the dismantled stove to make a small fire, enough to keep the cabin above freezing while he worked. The twist burned for 8 minutes. He fed another, and another, each one a small subtraction from a supply that could not be replaced. Then he pulled on his coat and walked south toward the abandoned lime kiln. The kiln sat in a shallow draw 2 miles from the cabin, its walls half collapsed, its stone arch open to the sky. Settlers had scavenged from it for years, stone for foundations, iron bands for barrel repairs, but no one had wanted the firebrick. Firebrick was heavy and strange and useless for anything a prairie farmer needed. It sat in piles where the kiln walls had fallen, crusted with lime dust and snow, cracked in places where water had frozen in the joints. Torgrim loaded his sled, a flatboard with rope handles, not a proper sled, and began dragging brick. Each firebrick weighed 7 pounds. He needed at least 60 for the core. That was 420 pounds of brick, 2 miles through drifts, on a board with no runners. He made 3 trips the first day, 20 bricks per trip, 60 bricks. The muscles in his legs burned by the second trip and screamed by the third. His shoulders felt like something had been pulled loose inside them. He ate cold cornbread standing in the snow, because sitting down meant he might not stand up again. Kittel met him at the door after the third trip and said, "Your hands are bleeding." Torgrim looked at his palms. The rope had worn through his gloves. The skin beneath was raw and split, the blood frozen into dark lines across the creases. He had not felt it. The cold had taken the pain and replaced it with a numbness that felt almost kind. "Get the tallow," he said. News reached Jonas Pike before the brick was even stacked. A man named Einar, who lived between the lime kiln and the settlement, saw Torgrim dragging the sled and mentioned it at Pike's store the way people mention things they find puzzling, not maliciously, but with the curiosity of someone who cannot figure out why a man with 2 children and no firewood would spend his energy hauling worthless brick through a blizzard. Pike listened. Pike was 46, the owner of the general store, the seller of coal by the hundredweight, and the holder of Torgrim Vangen's account. Torgrim owed him for flour, nails, lamp oil, and a half-dozen other small purchases that added up to a number neither of them said aloud, but both of them knew. Pike was not a cruel man, but he was a practical one. And practical men understand that a debtor who destroys his only stove is a debtor who may never pay. There was also the matter of the claim. If Torgrim failed, if the children were sent away, if the cabin was abandoned, the improvements on the land became available. The lumber, the well, the sod work, the fencing. A man who bought those improvements at distress prices and filed his own claim on the quarter section could do very well. Pike had not thought this through in detail. He did not need to. The logic sat in the back of his mind the way all profitable logic sits, quietly, patiently, waiting to be useful. Pike rode out with Moses Bell and Beret Lunde on a clear morning 3 days after the storm. The sky was white, and the sun sat low on the horizon, throwing long shadows across the drifts. They found the cabin door open, the cast-iron stove in pieces beside the step, and Torgrim on his knees laying the first course of firebrick on a stone pad he had built from a root-cellar field stone. The children were wrapped in quilts on the bed. A small fire of hay twist burned in a tin bucket near the door. The cabin was cold enough that breath hung visible in the air. Pike took it all in with the expression of a man watching a neighbor drown while holding a rope he had no intention of throwing. "Vangen," he said. "What is this?" Torgrim did not look up. He was fitting a fire brick against the stone pad, checking the level with a straight piece of lumber. A heater, he said. You had a heater, Pike said. It is lying in the snow outside your door. Moses Bell walked around the half-built structure. He saw the charcoal drawing pinned to the wall. He saw the throat, partially built, the firebrick standing in 2 rows with a gap between them. He saw the space where the turn would go, and the cleared stretch of floor along the north wall where the bench was supposed to sit. The chimney will not draft, Moses said. You have too many turns. 1 turn, Torgrim said. 1 turn is enough to kill the draft. I have seen it. Beret stood near the bed. She looked at Marte, who looked back at her with the flat patience of a child who has learned that adults make decisions and children survive them. Beret pulled a quilt tighter around the girl's shoulders and said nothing. Pike stepped closer. A man who breaks his stove before winter is no man to trust with credit, he said. The words landed in the cabin like something thrown. Torgrim's hands stopped moving. He held the firebrick against the stone and waited. I have extended you flour, Pike continued, nails, oil. That account is open because I believed you were a man who could provide. This... He gestured at the dismantled stove, the raw firebrick, the charcoal drawing. This is not providing. This is... I do not know what this is. The children should be sent away, Pike said. Before this, experiment kills them. Torgrim set the firebrick down. He stood up. He was taller than Pike and thinner, and the difference was visible in a way that made the thinness look like something earned rather than something suffered. He picked up the candle he had been using to check the draft and held it near the temporary throat, just the first course of firebrick, barely higher than his knee. The flame bent sideways, pulled toward the channel by air that moved through the gap between the brick rows. That is the draft, Torgrim said. Moses saw it, the flame leaning steady and clear, drawn by a movement of air that should not have existed in an unfinished structure. He saw it, and his expression changed, not to belief, but to the particular stillness of a man who has noticed something he cannot immediately dismiss. He said nothing. Pike saw it too, but Pike was not looking at the flame. He was looking at the children. Draft is not heat, Pike said, and heat is not winter. He turned and walked out. Moses followed. Beret paused at the door. How many days? She asked. 5, Torgrim said. Maybe 6. You do not have 6 days of fuel for even that bucket fire. I know. She left. The settlement decided Torgrim Vangen had lost his mind. It was not a formal decision. It was the way settlements decide things, through conversation at the store, through glances exchanged over fence posts, through the particular silence that falls when someone's name is mentioned, and no one wants to be the first to say what everyone is thinking. Have you ever built something that everyone around you said was foolish? Have you ever kept working while the people who should have supported you shook their heads and walked away? Tell us in the comments, what did you build and who doubted you? Pike cut off Torgrim's credit. He did not announce it. He simply told the clerk that Vangen's account was suspended until further notice. When Torgrim sent Kittle for lamp oil the next day, the boy came back empty-handed and silent. No one offered to lend tools. The settlement had limited resources and unlimited opinions, and the opinion had formed that lending to Torgrim was lending to a dead man's project. Beret continued leaving hay twists on the step, not every day, but often enough that the children did not freeze in the nights while Torgrim worked. She left them without comment. The twists appeared like something the wind had deposited. Torgrim worked. He woke before dawn and hauled clay from the creek bank, breaking through ice with a mattock and scraping the gray-brown earth into a bucket. The clay was heavy and cold, and it froze to his gloves. He mixed it with sand and ash in proportions he remembered from the kiln. 2 parts clay, 1 part sand, a half part ash, and packed it between the firebrick joints with his bare hands because gloves were too thick for the gaps. The first course of the fire throat went up on the stone pad, 7 inches by 7 inches, lined on all sides with firebrick standing on edge. Above it, the vertical feed chamber, a rectangular column where split billets would stand upright, their bases in the flame, their tops feeding downward as the bottoms burned away. The feed chamber was Torgrim's invention. His father's stove had a front-loading door, but Torgrim had no casting equipment and no time. The vertical feed used gravity. Load it once, and the wood feeds itself as it burns. The sideburn tunnel came next, a horizontal channel leading from the throat toward the north wall, lined with firebrick and sealed with clay. This was where the hottest combustion happened, where the gases that rose from the burning wood met enough heat and enough oxygen to ignite. Torgrim did not know the word secondary combustion. He knew that when the throat was hot enough, the smoke caught fire, and the flame turned from yellow to blue-edged, and the heat intensified in a way that felt almost violent. Then the turn. The channel dropped downward, forcing the hot gases to reverse direction, a 180-degree turn that added length to the path and kept the heat inside the structure. His father's stove had multiple turns. Torgrim had time and material for one, but one was enough to change the fundamental equation. Instead of a straight shot from fire to sky, the gases now had to surrender heat to firebrick on 3 sides of the turn before continuing. And then the bench. 8 feet of field stone and clay along the north wall, hollowed inside to create a channel that the exhaust traveled through before reaching the chimney pipe. The bench was the storage. The bench was the reason any of this mattered. When the fire burned, the bench absorbed heat. When the fire died, the bench gave it back, slowly, steadily, over hours that no cast iron stove could match. The chimney connected at the far end of the bench, rising through the roof, at the same point the old stovepipe had exited. Torgrim sealed the joint with clay and wrapped it with the sheet iron collar he had salvaged from the cast iron stove. His hands split. The cold and the clay and the constant gripping cracked the skin across his knuckles and between his fingers. He wrapped them in strips of flour, sacking, and kept working. He ate when Marte brought him cornbread. He slept when he fell asleep, sitting against the wall, his hands still gray with clay. Marta carried warm stones from the bucket fire to press against drying clay joints, because Torgrim had told her the joints needed heat to cure, and she understood tasks better than explanations. Kittle gathered grass twists from the edges of a haystack a half-mile south, coming back with his arms full and his cheeks cut red by wind-driven snow crust. On the second day of construction, a hairline crack appeared in the first fire brick joint after Torgrim lit a small test flame to check the draw. The flame caught. The throat warmed, and then a thin dark line opened along the clay seam where the first course met the second, and a whisper of smoke curled through the gap and rose toward the ceiling. Torgrim stared at the crack. He pressed his thumb against it and felt warmth, not the dry warmth of cured clay, but the damp warmth of a seal that had not finished setting. He had rushed. The clay needed more time. The fire needed less intensity. He had done what cold and fear make every builder do. He had pushed too fast because the deadline was not a date on a calendar, but a sound. The sound of wind finding every weakness in a cabin that was losing the only race that mattered. Was the design flawed? Or had he just built it wrong? He would not know until the crack either held or spread, and he could not wait to find out, because waiting meant burning hay twists in a bucket while the temperature outside dropped another degree with every passing hour. He mixed fresh clay, packed the crack, and did not light another test fire. The joint needed a day to set. He did not have a day, but he gave it a night. One night of cold in the cabin, one night of the bucket fire and the hay twists, and the children wrapped in quilts, because some things cannot be forced without breaking them worse. Outside, the sky had gone the color of old iron. The The wind had died to a mutter, which was not a comfort. On the Dakota prairie, when the wind stops, it is gathering itself. The temperature had dropped past zero and kept falling. Somewhere to the west, the telegraph lines were failing under the weight of ice, and the messages that should have warned the settlements about what was coming were freezing in the wires before they could arrive. Torgrim sat beside the bucket fire with Marte asleep against his shoulder, and Kittel curled at the foot of the bed, and he looked at the half-built heater in the darkness of the cabin. The firebrick caught the faint light of the bucket fire and held it, a dull orange glow along the edges of the throat, as if the bricks were remembering a warmth they had not yet received. 5 days, maybe 6, and the weather was not waiting. The crack held. By morning, the clay had set enough that when Torgrim pressed his thumbnail against it, the surface resisted, not hard, not finished, but holding. He did not test it with fire. He left it alone and turned to the bench. The bench was the slowest part because it was the heaviest. Each field stone had to be carried from the root cellar, 50 yards through drifts that reached Torgrim's waist. The stones weighed between 15 and 40 pounds each, and the bench needed a double wall, outer stones for structure, inner channel for exhaust, packed with clay between and on top and underneath, until the whole thing sat against the north wall like a low coffin filled with passages. He worked in silence. Marte fed the bucket fire. Kittel hauled sand from a gravel bank near the creek where the wind had scoured the snow thin enough to dig. The boy did not ask questions. He watched what Torgrim did and tried to do the next version of it without being told. By midday of the third construction day, the bench channel was half built, and the cabin looked like something between a workshop and a ruin. Firebrick dust covered the floor. Clay smears marked every surface Torgrim had touched. The bucket fire filled the room with a haze that sat at eye level and stung. That was when Oddman Breck arrived. He came from the east, from the direction of Sioux Falls, driving a wagon loaded with lime sacks, chisels, and worn trowels wrapped in oilcloth. The wagon moved slowly because the road was still half buried and because Oddman's left knee did not bend properly, an old injury from a scaffold fall that had ended his work on tall chimneys and sent him into the smaller trade of stove setting and hearth repair. He was 64. His hands were enormous, scarred across the knuckles, and steady in a way that made them seem heavier than they were. He had been born in a valley near Bergen and had worked stone since he was 13. He had set Scandinavian tile stoves in the Norwegian neighborhoods around Minneapolis for 15 years before the work dried up, and he began traveling to wherever chimneys needed mending. He had stopped in the settlement to repair a cracked chimney at the church and had heard Pike laughing about the smoke eater while buying lamp oil. Pike had told the story the way Pike told everything, with the precision of a man building a case. Vangen had torn apart his only stove. Vangen was laying firebrick in a 12-by-16 cabin with 2 children and no fuel. Vangen believed he could heat Dakota with mud and brick. The laughter in Pike's store was not unkind. It was the laughter of men who had seen winter kill better prepared people and could not imagine how a dismantled stove and a pile of cracked brick would change the math. Oddman did not laugh. He bought his oil and asked for directions to Vangen's claim. He found the cabin with its door propped open and Torgrim kneeling inside the half-built structure, fitting a fire brick into the turn, the downward channel where hot gases would reverse direction. Oddman stood in the doorway for a long time without speaking. He looked at the throat. He looked at the feed chamber. He looked at the turn and the bench channel and the charcoal drawing on the flour sack pinned to the wall. Then he looked at the crack Torgrim had patched. "You remembered the turn," Oddman said. His Norwegian was from the coast, flatter than Torgrim's inland dialect, but the words were clear. "But you forgot the mercy hole." Torgrim looked up. He saw a man old enough to be his father, standing in his doorway with lime dust on his coat and a trowel handle sticking out of his belt like a weapon. Mercy hole, Torgrim repeated. Clean out. If you seal this thing shut, you cannot reach the ash. The ash builds in the turn and in the bench channel, and it chokes the draft. Within 3 weeks, you're back where you started, a box full of smoke. Odmund stepped inside and crouched beside the turn, his bad knee cracking loud enough that Kittle flinched. He ran his finger along the inside of the channel. You need 2 doors. Tin. One at the base of the turn, one at the far end of the bench, before the chimney joint. Small enough to seal, large enough to get a scraper through. I do not have tin, Torgrim said. You have a stove lying in pieces outside your door. Cut the side panel. 2 pieces, 8 inches by 6. Hinge them with wire. Odmund pulled the trowel from his belt and tapped the clay joint at the base of the throat. This mix, what is it? 2 parts clay, 1 sand, half ash. Add lime, a fistful per batch. The calciumite lets the clay move when the brick expands. Without it, you will get cracks at every joint inside 2 firings. You have already gotten one. He pointed at the patch. I do not have lime. Odmund looked at him. Then he looked at his wagon, visible through the open door, loaded with sacks of lime he had hauled from Sioux Falls for the church chimney job. He said nothing for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced a pipe and a pouch of tobacco, and sat down on the half-built bench, as if he had been invited. I am not giving you lime, Odmund said. I am trading you lime for labor. The church chimney needs repointing, and my knee will not let me work the scaffold alone. When this is finished, you climb. Agreed, Torgrim said. Show me your draft. Torgrim lit a twist of flax straw and held it near the throat. The flame bent sideways and pulled toward the channel, steady and clear. Odmund watched it the way a man watches something he has seen 1,000 times but never tires of seeing. The movement of air through a designed space, invisible made visible. You have the shape, Odmund said. You do not have the habit. He made Torgrim tear out the small test flame and start again. Before lighting anything, he said, warm the chimney. He took a twist of burning straw and held it inside the chimney base, at the point where the bench channel met the pipe. The heat rose. The air in the pipe began to move. Odmund held the straw until it burned to his fingers, then dropped it and immediately lit a second twist inside the throat. The difference was instant. With a warm chimney, the draft caught in seconds. Without it, the cold air in the pipe resisted, and the smoke had nowhere to go but back into the room. Draft before heat, Odmund said. Every time. You preheat the flue or you smoke yourself out. Your father knew this. My father had a Finnish stove, Torgrim said. Your father had a stove someone built for the first time once. Every stove was unfinished at some point. The principle does not wait for the mason to finish. Odmund stayed. He did not say he was staying. He simply did not leave. He slept in his wagon the first night, and in the cabin the second, on the floor beside the bench with his coat over him and his bad knee propped on a folded blanket. He ate what Torgrim ate, cornbread, salt pork, boiled grain, and he did not complain about the quality or the quantity, though both were poor. He taught through action, not explanation. When the clay mix was wrong, he did not say it was wrong. He mixed a batch beside Torgrim's batch and pressed both with his thumb and waited for Torgrim to see the difference. His mix held the thumbprint cleanly. Torgrim's crumbled at the edge. When the throat bricks were set too loosely, he pulled one free, scraped the joint, reapplied the mortar, and set the brick again with a single firm tap of his trowel. Torgrim watched the tap. It was not hard. It was precise. The brick settled a 1/4 inch and stopped. seated perfectly, and Oddman moved on without looking back. Fire must be narrow, not starved, Oddman said on the third day of working together. He was standing beside the completed throat, looking down into it. Every settler I have met believes that saving fuel means less fire, less air, a smaller flame. They close the damper, and the smoke backs up, and they breathe poison all winter. They think frugality and suffocation are the same thing. He picked up a stick and drew in the clay dust on the floor, a wide firebox like the cast-iron stove. "Big and cold," he said. "The fire spreads out. The temperature drops. The wood smolders instead of burning. The smoke is thick because the gas never gets hot enough to ignite. You lose half your fuel as waste." Then he drew the narrow throat, small and hot. The fire has nowhere to spread. The temperature climbs. The gas hits 600 degrees, maybe 700, and it catches. The smoke burns. What goes up the chimney is clean because everything combustible has already been consumed. "But it burns faster," Torgrim said. "Yes, and that is the point. You do not want a fire that lasts. You want a fire that finishes, a fire that does its work and stops. The mass winds." He put his hand on the bench stones. "The mass is what lasts. The fire is the servant. The stone is the master." Torgrim understood this in his hands before he understood it in his mind. He had spent his entire time in Dakota fighting the stove, trying to make it burn slower, trying to stretch each stick, trying to coax duration out of a device built for intensity. The cast-iron box was designed to be hot and brief. He had been trying to make it warm and long. That was the mismatch. That was why the damper led to smoke and the open draft led to waste. He had been asking the wrong machine to do the wrong job. The new heater did not ask the fire to last. It asked the stone to remember. Construction continued. Day 3. The turn completed. The downward channel sealed with firebrick on 3 sides and clay on the 4th. Day 4. The bench channel connected to the chimney pipe, the joint sealed with clay and lime. The 2 clean-out doors cut from the cast-iron side panel and hinged with wire. Day 5 was supposed to be the break-in fire, but the crack in the first joint reappeared, not in the same place but in the adjacent seam where the throat met the feed chamber. Oddmund saw it before Torgrim did. "Stop," he said. He put his hand over Torgrim's hand, which was reaching for the clay pot. "Do not patch it. Look at it." The crack ran along the mortar line for 3 inches, thin as a hair. Smoke from the test flame seeped through it in a thread so faint it was almost invisible. But Oddmund could see it, and he could see what it meant. The fire brick is expanding at a different rate than the clay. Your joints are too rigid. The lime will help, but you also need to leave a gap, a soft joint, at every 4th course. Pack it with ash instead of clay. The ash compresses when the brick expands. The clay does not. "I have already laid 12 courses, Torgrim said. "Then pull every 4th course and repack it." "That is a day of work. That is a day of work that keeps the cabin from filling with smoke on the first real firing. Pull them." Torgrim pulled them. It cost a full day. A day he did not have. The weather outside had settled into a gray stillness that felt less like calm than like held breath. The temperature sat at 8 degrees above zero, which was not cold enough to kill, but was cold enough to remind everyone that the real cold was still coming. The bucket fire ate hay twists at the rate of 8 per hour. Beret's supply on the steppe had thinned. Torgrim's own straw sacks were nearly empty. Moses Bell came back on the 5th day. He rode up to the cabin, did not dismount, and looked through the open door at the structure taking shape inside. He saw Oddmund. He saw the bench, now 3/4 complete, its surface smooth with wet clay drying in the cold air. He saw the clean outdoors and the chimney connection and the throat standing open like a dark mouth waiting to be fed. "You found a mason," Moses said. "He found me," Torgrim said. Moses looked at Oddmund. "You are staking your name on this?" Oddmund was sitting on a bucket, sharpening a chisel. He did not look up. "I am staking my lime," he said, "which costs more than a name." "That sound is not safety," Moses said, gesturing at the throat where a whisper of draft was audible. "That is a stove eating itself." "You will know the difference when you see it," Oddmund said. He still did not look up. Moses left without another word, but he rode slowly, and twice he looked back over his shoulder at the cabin, where no smoke rose from the chimney because the chimney was not yet connected to anything that burned. The break-in fire happened on the 6th day. Oddman insisted on 3 small fires before any full charge. "You are drying the clay," he said. "You are teaching the brick where to expand. If you fire this hard on the first burn, you will crack the core, and I will have to tear it out and start again, and neither of us has time for that." The first break-in fire was a handful of dry kindling in the throat. Torgrim opened the lower clean-out door, the mercy hole, and held a burning twist of straw inside the chimney base to warm the flue. The air in the pipe began to move. He closed the clean-out and lit the kindling. Smoke poured into the cabin. Marte ran to the far wall. Kittel covered his face with his sleeve. Torgrim reached for the damper, but there was no damper. The new heater had no damper. It had the bypass. "Open the bypass," Oddmund said. He did not shout. His voice was level, the voice of a man who has seen first fires smoke 100 times and knows that panic makes smoke worse. The bypass was a small iron flap at the base of the chimney connection, a shortcut that allowed smoke to go directly up the pipe without traveling through the bench. Torgrim pulled it open. The smoke hesitated, then swirled toward the chimney and rose. Within a minute, the air cleared. "Now close it slowly," Oddmund said. "The bench is cold. The air inside it does not want to move. You have to pull it through gradually. Close the bypass 1 inch at a time. Let the draft build." Torgrim closed the bypass by inches. The smoke traveled farther into the bench channel with each adjustment. After 5 minutes, the bypass was fully closed, and the smoke was traveling the complete path: throat, tunnel, turn, bench, chimney. The air in the cabin cleared. Moses, who had returned for reasons he did not explain and was standing at the edge of the property watching, saw the smoke pour from the door, then thin, then vanish. He saw the chimney produce nothing for a long moment, then a faint shimmer of heat rising from the cap. He said nothing. He mounted his horse and rode away. The second break-in fire was larger, split kindling, a handful of cottonwood splints, enough to produce visible flame in the throat for 20 minutes. The throat temperature climbed. Torgrim could feel it through the firebrick, a steady warmth spreading outward from the core. The bench remained cold, but the air at the chimney end was noticeably warm when he held his hand over the clean-out. The third fire was the first real test. Torgrim loaded 2 small oak billets into the vertical feed chamber and lit them from below with kindling. The fire caught fast, faster than any fire he had built in the cast-iron stove. The narrow throat concentrated the flame. The fire brick reflected heat back into the combustion zone. The temperature inside the throat climbed past the point where the smoke itself ignited. Torgrim saw it happen. The yellow flame in the throat turned blue-edged, then blue, then a color that was almost white. The roar was audible, a low, steady sound that came from the throat and resonated through the bench channel like breath through a long pipe. "There," Oddmund said. He put his hand on the bench stones 4 feet from the firebox. "Count." Torgrim counted. After 3 minutes, the stones under Oddmund's hand were warm. After 10, They were hot enough that Oddmund pulled his hand away. After 30 minutes, the entire bench radiated heat, not the sharp, momentary heat of a cast-iron stove, but a deep, even warmth that seemed to come from inside the stone rather than from its surface. The fire burned for 45 minutes. The billets collapsed into coals. The flame died, and the bench stayed warm. 2 hours after the flame died, Torgrim pressed his hand against the bench stones near the throat end. They were still warm. Not as hot as during the fire, but warm, holdable, livable. He marked the time on the cabin wall with charcoal, lit at 3 in the afternoon, stone warm at 5. He would check again at midnight. Beret came in the late afternoon, uninvited. She stood in the doorway and felt the warmth from 6 feet away. "The bench is warm," she said. It was not a question. "The bench is warm," Torgrim confirmed. "A warm stone is not a winter." "No, but a warm stone at midnight might be a night." She touched the bench with the flat of her hand. She held it there for a long time. Then she looked at the chimney pipe, which was producing almost no visible smoke, just a faint shimmer of heat above the cap. "Where did the smoke go?" she asked. "It burned," Oddmund said. "Inside the throat. The fire was hot enough to consume it." Beret looked at him. She looked at Torgrim. She looked at the children, who were sitting on the bed, not wrapped in quilts anymore, because the cabin was warm enough that they did not need to be. She did not say anything else. She left. But she did not leave Haytwis on the step. For the first time, she walked away without leaving something behind. Moses warned people at the store. "No smoke means poor draft or a dead fire," he said. He believed it. In his experience, a chimney that did not smoke was a chimney that had failed. The absence of smoke was not efficiency, it was silence. And silence in a chimney meant the fire had lost. Pike heard this and repeated it with embellishment. "Vangen's chimney has gone corpse cold," he told customers. "The man has built a tomb and put his children in it." The sky turned yellow-gray on the 8th day after the storm. The color was familiar to anyone who had lived through a Dakota October, the color of air too cold to hold moisture, pressing down on the prairie like a hand on a chest. A telegraph boy reached the settlement on horseback with news that the line west had failed. Ice on the wires. No messages coming through from Fort Pierre or Huron. Wind scoured the snow crust hard enough to cut exposed skin. Kittle came in from gathering straw with a red line across his cheek that looked like a knife mark. It was not a knife. It was air. Oddmund packed his wagon that evening. The church chimney needed him. Sunday service was 2 days away, and the pastor had sent word that the flu was drawing badly, and the sanctuary would be unusable in the cold. Oddmund's knee had stiffened from a week of kneeling on Torgrim's floor, and he moved slowly as he wrapped his tools and loaded the lime. Before leaving, he made Torgrim repeat the lighting order. "Bypass open," Torgrim said. "Then what?" "Flue warmed, twist of straw in the chimney base." "Then, small dry kindling, flame in the throat, wait for the roar." "And when do you close the bypass?" "When the draft pulls through the bench without help, when I feel warm air at the far clean-out. And if it smokes back." "Open the bypass again, rewarm the flue, start slower." Oddmund looked at him the way a man looks at something he has made, not with pride, which would have been presumptuous, but with the particular attention of a person who has spent enough time on a thing to know where it is strong and where it might fail. "The bench is honest," Oddmund said. "If you treat it honestly, it will answer. If you rush it, it will smoke. Do not blame the stone when the fault is the fire." He climbed onto the wagon seat, his knee audible in the cold. Torgrim stood at the step with the children. "When will you come back? Kittle asked. When the chimney is done, Oddmund said, or when the weather tells me to. He did not say which he expected first. He clicked to the horse, and the wagon moved east, its wheels cutting through the snow crust with a sound like tearing cloth. That night, Marte woke with fever. She was hot when Torgrim touched her forehead and dry when she should have been sweating. She coughed, a deep sound that seemed to come from a place inside her chest that a 7-year-old should not have. Her eyes were bright and her skin was flushed, and she said she was cold, which was the worst thing she could have said, because the cabin was warm. The bench held heat from the evening fire. The temperature inside the cabin was above 40 degrees, and Marte was cold. Torgrim knew what fever did. He had watched it take Ragna. He knew the speed of it, the way it arrived like a visitor and settled in like an occupant, and refused to leave until it had taken something. Ragna's fever had taken 3 days. By the 2nd day, she could not stand. By the 3rd, she did not know where she was. He wrapped Marty in every blanket he owned and laid her on the bench, which was the warmest surface in the cabin. He boiled water on the remaining coals and made her drink. She drank a little and pushed the cup away. Kittle sat beside her and held her hand and did not speak. The storm arrived at dawn. It was not the October 15th blizzard. That storm had already come and gone, the opening act of what settlers would later call the hard winter. This was the second wave, a November lock-in that swept down from the northwest with a sound like a freight train heard from underground. The wind hit the cabin wall, and the tar paper on the north side cracked and flapped and tore at the corner. Snow drove through every gap. The door shuddered in its frame. The temperature, which had been hovering near 0, dropped below it and kept falling. Torgrim fed the heater. He opened the bypass. He warmed the flue with a twist of straw. He watched the flame take, watched the air pull through the chimney base, waited until the draft felt steady. Then he loaded the throat with dry kindling. The last of the oak splints Kittle had split, and waited for the roar. The roar did not come. The wind outside had reversed the draft. Air pushed down the chimney pipe instead of pulling up. Smoke spilled from the throat into the cabin, a thick gray cloud that rolled across the ceiling and sank toward the bed where Marte lay with her fever and her bright eyes. Kittle grabbed a blanket and held it over Marte's face. Torgrim felt the smoke in his own lungs, sharp, acid, the taste of wood gas that had not burned. His eyes watered. The heater was doing exactly what the cast-iron stove had done. The wind was winning. He remembered the mercy hole, not the clean-out function, the draft function. Oddmund had said it once in passing while cutting the tin doors. If the wind reverses, open the lower clean-out. The cold air falls into the base and creates a pocket of pressure. The smoke goes up because down is already full. Torgrim dropped to his knees and pulled the lower clean-out door open. Cold air flooded in, freezing air from outside, pouring through the gap in the chimney base and filling the bottom of the channel. The smoke in the cabin hesitated. It hung in the air for a moment like something confused. Then it began to move, not down, not sideways, but up. The cold air at the base created a density difference. The hot smoke had nowhere to go but into the throat and through the channel and the turn in the bench and out. The draft caught. The smoke thinned. Torgrim closed the clean-out door halfway, leaving just enough gap to maintain the pressure difference, and he lit a new twist of flax straw in the throat. The flame took. It took slowly, not the instant catch of a warm flue start, but a tentative, reaching flame that crawled up the straw and found the kindling and began to build. Torgrim fed it carefully. One splint, then another. Then a cottonwood stick no thicker than his wrist. The fire grew. The throat warmed. The firebrick began to radiate. And then the sound came. The neighbors later called it a growl. It was not a growl. It was the sound of air accelerating through a narrow channel as the temperature and draft aligned, a low, resonant hum that came from the throat and traveled through the bench channel and vibrated in the stones along the north wall. It was the sound of secondary combustion. The smoke was burning. The gas was igniting inside the throat. The flame in the feed chamber turned from yellow to blue-edged, and the heat intensified until Torgrim could not hold his hand within a foot of the opening. He loaded one large oak billet into the vertical feed chamber. It was the biggest piece of wood he had, 18 inches long, 6 inches thick, dense and dry and heavy in his hands. He stood it on end in the chamber, its base resting on the bed of coals, its top visible through the loading gap. Then he added 3 small cottonwood sticks around it as kindling supports and closed the gap with a flat stone. The oak caught, not with flame. Oak does not flame easily when it is that thick. It caught with heat. The surface glowed. Gas rose from the grain and entered the throat and ignited in the firebrick chamber with a blue light that was visible through the mortar joints. The burn was intense and clean. The chimney produced nothing, no smoke, no visible vapor, only a shimmer of heat above the cap that would have been invisible against the gray sky if anyone had been outside to look. No one was. The storm had buried the settlement. Inside the cabin, the bench grew warm, not quickly. Stone does not hurry, but steadily, the way a river rises, an inch at a time, unnoticeable from moment to moment, undeniable over hours. Torgrim tracked it with his hand, moving from the throat end to the chimney end, 3 feet warm after 10 minutes, 5 feet warm after 30, the full 8 feet warm after an hour. The stones near the chimney end cooler than the stones near the throat, but warm enough to melt snow pressed against them. Marte lay on the bench. The warmth entered her through the blankets and the quilts, and the fever fought it, and the fever was losing. Not quickly, fever does not retreat any faster than stone heats, but she stopped shivering, her breathing steadied. She slept. If you are invested in what happens to this family, if you need to know whether this heater holds through the night, hit subscribe and stay with us. Because the storm outside is not finished. The storm was not finished. The wind built through the afternoon and into the evening, and by midnight it was screaming. The tar paper on the north wall tore completely free, and the boards beneath it flexed inward with every gust. Snow found the gaps and sifted in, building small white drifts along the baseboard. The temperature outside dropped past 20 below zero. The water pail near the door froze solid, a block of ice in a wooden bucket. But the water pail on the bench had only a skin of ice on its surface. Beneath the skin, the water was liquid. Torgrim sat awake. The fire had burned down hours ago. The oak billet had collapsed into a pile of coals that glowed faintly in the feed chamber, giving off almost no visible heat. The cabin should have been cold. By every rule he had learned in Dakota, by every experience with the cast iron stove, by every night he had spent feeding fuel into a box that ate it and gave nothing back, the cabin should have been cold. It was not cold. The bench radiated. The stones gave back what the fire had given them, slowly, steadily, as if the stone had a memory of its own. The air near the bench was warm enough that Torgrim could sit beside it in his shirt sleeves. The air near the door was freezing. He could feel the line between the two zones as clearly as a wall, but the bench zone was livable. Marte slept. Kittle slept. The fire was dead, and the warmth continued. He marked the time on the wall. The fire had been lit at 4 in the afternoon. The bench was warm now at midnight, 8 hours since the flame, and the stone was still giving. Across the settlement, the night was different. Berit Lunde's cabin sat a mile and a half south. Her stove, a proper cast iron box, bigger than Torgrim's, had been burned through hay twists at the usual rate, 8 minutes per twist. She had braided 300 twists in the autumn. By midnight, she had burned through 40 of them, and the cabin was barely above freezing. Her boy slept in his coat. She fed the stove, and the stove ate, and the cold came back, and she fed it again. There was no end to the cycle. There was only the next twist and the next 8 minutes. Moses Bell's nephew, Gideon, tried to cross to town before dawn. He thought the wind had dropped. It had not dropped. It had shifted. He made it half a mile from the Bell farm before the whiteout closed around him, and he lost the fence line. He wandered in a circle for 20 minutes before his horse found the barn by smell. He came in with frost on his eyelashes and the tip of his left ear white with frostbite. Moses wrapped the ear in warm cloth and did not say what they both knew, that another 10 minutes would have killed him. Pike's store had customers that night, 3 families who had come in before the storm hit and could not leave. They crowded around Pike's stove, which was the biggest in the settlement, a cast-iron beast with a 12-inch pipe. Pike fed it coal. Good coal, the coal he sold by the hundredweight at prices that kept him comfortable. The stove roared. The pipe glowed red at the first joint. But the store was drafty and the bodies crowded the air, and by midnight the chimney clogged with soot from the coal, and smoke began to spill from the seams. Pike damped the stove. The smoke worsened. He opened it. The coal burned faster. The chimney would need cleaning, but cleaning a chimney during a blizzard was not a thing anyone would do. Dawn came gray and slow, the sky indistinguishable from the snow. The wind had dropped to a steady moan that was worse than the screaming because it promised nothing, not an end, not an escalation, just a continuity that could last days. Moses Bell saddled his horse at first light. He told his wife he was checking the road. He was not checking the road. He was checking on the Vangen cabin, because Moses had buried settlers, and he knew that the cabins that went quiet in the night were the cabins that needed opening in the morning. He had seen the dismantled stove. He had seen the firebrick and the clay and the children. He had heard Pike say, "corpse cold," and he had spent the night thinking about the candle flame bending sideways in a half-built throat, and the shimmer of heat above a chimney that produced no smoke, and the fact that he had spent 30 years in Dakota and had never seen a chimney do that. The ride took an hour through drifts. Moses followed the fence line where he could find it, and Dead reckoned where he could not. The cold was deep enough that his beard froze to his collar, and his horse's nostrils crusted with ice. He came over the last rise and saw the cabin. No smoke. The chimney stood clear against the white sky, rimmed with frost, producing nothing visible. The snow had drifted against the door to a height of 3 feet. No tracks led in or out. The tar paper on the north wall hung in strips, exposing bare boards. The cabin looked exactly like the cabins Moses had opened in springs past, the ones where the door swung in, and the cold had finished what the storm had started. He dismounted. He waded through the drift to the door. He brushed snow from the latch. He pressed his ear against the boards. He heard a child cough. Then he heard movement, the particular sound of someone small shifting under blankets, the creak of a bed frame, a voice too low to make out. Moses put his hand on the latch. It was warm, not hot, warm. The iron had absorbed heat from the inside of the cabin and was holding it in the metal the way a stone holds sun. He pulled the door open. Snow fell inward. Warm air pushed outward, not a blast, not the wall of heat that a cast-iron stove throwing maximum fire would produce, but a steady, even warmth that met the outside cold at the threshold and held its ground. Inside, the cabin was dim and still. The fire was dead. The throat was dark. No coals glowed in the feed chamber, but the bench along the north wall radiated heat that Moses could feel from the doorway, 6 feet away, through the cold air pouring in from outside. Marte lay on the bench, wrapped in blankets, her cheeks flushed with fever, but her body warm. Kittles sat beside her, awake, holding a cup of water that was not frozen. Torgrim stood near the clean-out door with a twist of straw in his hand, about to begin the morning fire. The water pail near the bench had a skin of ice. Beneath the skin, the water moved when Moses touched the bucket. Liquid. In a cabin with no fire, in a storm that had frozen water solid in every other building in the settlement, the water was liquid. Moses looked at the bench. He looked at the chimney. He looked at the charcoal marks on the wall, the times Torgrim had recorded. Lit at 4 in the afternoon, stone warm at midnight, stone still warm at 6 in the morning, 14 hours since the fire died, and the bench was still above freezing. Torgrim had marked a second line. The bench had finally cooled to cold, not freezing, but cold, no longer radiating noticeable warmth at 10 in the morning. 18 hours from firing to the last usable heat. Moses removed his gloves. He put both hands on the bench, palms flat, the way a man puts his hands on something to confirm that it is real and not imagined. The stone was warm, warm enough to sleep beside, warm enough to keep water liquid, warm enough to hold a feverish child above the line where cold becomes dangerous. He stood there for a long time. He looked at the woodpile visible through the open door, the 19 billets and the cottonwood chunks, and the near-empty straw sacks. He had done the math a week ago. 6 cords needed, a quarter cord available, 6 nights of heat from a cast-iron stove. The heater had run one night on 1 billet and some kindling. If every night required the same, 1 large billet and a few sticks, the remaining fuel would last not 6 nights but 40, maybe 50. The math had changed. The numbers had bent. The thing Moses had said could not happen had happened in a 12 by 16 cabin with cracked boards and a torn north wall, with 2 children and a 31-year-old immigrant who had remembered his father's stove and built it out of scavenged brick and creek bank clay. Moses put his gloves back on. He looked at Torgrim. "I was wrong about the smoke," he said. The words came out like something pulled, not offered. "I thought no smoke meant no fire." He did not say anything else. He did not need to. He walked to the door and pulled it shut behind him and mounted his horse and rode toward town through drifts that reached the animal's chest. Torgrim lit the morning fire. He warmed the flue. He waited for the roar. And the bench, which had given everything it held through the longest night of the winter, began to fill again. Moses Bell did not go home. He went to Pike's store. The store was still crowded from the night, 3 families who had slept on the floor, their children stacked against the walls like cordwood, their coats still on because Pike's stove had smoked badly enough that he had damped it to a smolder, and the temperature inside the building had dropped to match. The chimney pipe showed a dark stain at the first joint, where creosote had sweated through during the night. The air smelled like coal tar and unwashed wool, and the particular sourness of too many people breathing the same air for too long. Pike was behind the counter, measuring flour for a woman whose name Moses did not know. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had spent the night feeding a stove that repaid him with smoke. Moses stood in the doorway until Pike looked up. "Vangen is alive," Moses said. Pike's hand stopped moving on the flour scoop. "The children? The girl has fever. The boy is well. The cabin is warm." "He cannot be warm. He had a quarter cord and a pile of brick." "He is warm. I put my hands on the stone. The fire was out. The stone was warm. The water in his pail was liquid." The store went quiet the way stores go quiet when the thing being said does not fit the thing that was expected. The woman with the flour looked at Moses. A man near the stove lowered his coffee tin. Pike set the scoop down. "How long since the fire?" Pike asked. He marked it on the wall. 14 hours when I arrived. He says the stone holds 18 before it cools. One fire. One billet. Oak. And kindling to light it. Pike said nothing for a long time. He picked up the flour scoop, set it down again, and wiped his hands on his apron in the gesture of a man whose hands need to move while his mind catches up. "One billet," he repeated. "One billet." Moses did not explain the mechanism. He did not understand it well enough to explain. He told them what he had seen, the dark throat, the dead fire, the warm bench, the liquid water, the warm latch, and let the facts do the work that arguments could not. A man who says I was wrong in a crowded store does not need to be eloquent. He needs only to be specific, and Moses was specific. The families in the store listened. They had spent the night feeding Pike's stove and breathing its smoke and shivering when the coal ran low. They understood fuel. They understood the arithmetic of winter. So many chords, so many months, so many degrees of cold between a family and the dark. The arithmetic Moses described did not match the arithmetic they knew. One billet for 18 hours of warmth was not an improvement. It was a different kind of math. Beret Lund heard the news not from Moses, but from her boy, who had gone to the store for salt and come back with a story instead. She stood in her cabin, cold, the stove eating hay twists, the air gray with smoke, and listened to her son describe a bench made of stone that held heat like a living thing. She did not speak until he finished. "Get my coat," she said. She walked to Torgrim's cabin through the drifts. The walk took 40 minutes. She arrived with snow to her waist and her face raw from the wind, and she pushed the door open without knocking. The cabin was warm, not hot. Warm the way a room is warm when the warmth comes from everywhere and nowhere, not from a single source radiating in one direction, but from mass, from surface, from the accumulated patience of stone that has been heated and is slowly giving back. Marte was sitting up on the bench. Her fever had not broken, but it had retreated. The flush was still in her cheeks, but her eyes were clear, and she was drinking water without being forced. Cattell was sweeping clay dust from the floor. Torgrim was at the clean-out door, scraping ash from the turn with a wire brush Oddmund had left behind. Beret looked at the bench. She looked at the chimney. She looked at Marte. "She is alive," Beret said. "She is alive." Beret walked to the bench and put her hand on the stone the way Moses had, flat, both palms, pressing down as if testing the ground before trusting it with weight. The stone was warm. Not as warm as it had been at midnight, Torgrim told her. The fire had been relit that morning, and the bench was refilling. But even in its cooled state, between fires, the stone was warmer than the air in Beret's own cabin, where her stove burned continuously. "The water pail," Beret said. She pointed at the bucket on the bench. The skin of ice had melted since Moses's visit. The water was clear and liquid. "It froze at the door," Torgrim said. He pointed at the second pail near the entrance, which was solid ice. "It did not freeze at the bench." Beret sat down on the bench. She sat there for a long time without speaking. The warmth entered through her skirt and her coat and her tired legs, and she felt something she had not felt since October, the absence of cold. Not heat, the absence of cold. There is a difference, and Beret knew it. Heat was the stove blasting at full draw, unbearable for 2 feet and useless at 10. The absence of cold was this, a steady surrounding warmth that did not peak or fade, that simply existed, as if the room itself had decided to be warm. How does it work? She asked. Torgrim showed her. He opened the clean-out door and let her look inside the bench channel, a passage 8 inches wide and 6 inches high, lined with stones and sealed with clay, blackened with soot from the exhaust that had traveled through it. He showed her the throat and the feed chamber and the turn. He showed her the charcoal drawing on the flour sack, now smudged and torn, but still legible. The fire burns hot and fast, he said. The smoke burns inside the throat because the throat is hot enough. The heat goes into the stone. The stone holds it. For how long? 18 hours from one full charge. Maybe longer if I fire twice. Beret looked at her hands on the warm stone. Can you build one in my cabin? That was the moment the heater stopped being Torgrim's survival and started being the settlement's. Torgrim did not answer immediately. He knew what the question meant. It meant more brick, more clay, more labor. It meant days of work in someone else's cabin while his own children still needed tending and Marte's fever still needed watching. It meant teaching what he had barely finished learning. I will need Oddmund, he said, and I will need brick. I will bring brick, Beret said. Tell me where to find it. The lime kiln, 2 miles south. The brick is heavy. I have a team. I have a sled. I have a son who can load. She stood up. What else? Clay, sand, fieldstone, the same as this. She left. She walked back through the drifts with a purpose that had not been in her stride when she arrived. And by the time she reached her own cabin, she had already begun calculating how many firebrick, how much clay, how many days. She was a woman who burned hay twists 8 minutes at a time, and she had just sat on warm stone in a cabin with no fire. The calculation was not complicated. Others came. Not many at first. The settlement was cautious, and Pike's doubt still carried weight, but enough. Arne Tveit, a farmer 2 miles north, arrived with a cracked stove door he thought Torgrim might use for parts. He left with a description of the throat dimensions and a promise to bring clay from his own creek bank. Halvor Espeland, who had a larger cabin and more wood but a wife and 4 children, came with questions about the bench, how thick, how long, whether fieldstone was better than limestone. He touched the bench. He counted the bricks. He asked how much 100 firebrick weighed and whether his floor would hold. Torgrim answered each question the same way, with specifics: 7 inches by 7 for the throat, at least 4 inches of brick thickness on all sides, the bench at least 10 inches deep, more if the stone was porous, clean out doors at both ends, warm the flue before every firing, never damp the fire down, let it burn hot and fast, and let the stone do the holding. He drew the design on boards for Arne and Halvor. He warned them about the soft joints, ash every 4th course, and the lime in the mortar and the bypass and the mercy hole. He warned them that skipping cleanouts could fill the bench channel with ash and choke the draft and fill the cabin with smoke that could kill a sleeping family before they woke. The fire is not the danger, he said. The blockage is the danger. A clean flue is a safe flue. A dirty flue is a death. He did not charge them. Arne offered a side of salt pork. Halvor offered to send his oldest boy to help with chores. Torgrim accepted both, because accepting help was different from accepting payment, and because his children needed food more than his pride needed protecting. Pike reacted the way Pike reacted to anything that threatened his position, with an escalation that looked like concern. He appeared at the store counter the morning after Moses's report and announced to anyone who would listen that a firebrick stove built by a man with no training was a fire hazard. He said the clay mortar would crack. He said the bench would leak carbon monoxide. He said the children were in more danger now than they had been with the cast iron stove, because at least the cast iron stove was a known quantity. He offered to buy the design, not the heater, the design. The drawing on the flour sack. He would pay the amount of Torgrim's outstanding account, flour, nails, oil, the accumulated debt that neither of them said aloud, in exchange for the right to control how the design was built and by whom. He framed it as safety. A trained stove setter should supervise every installation. Pike happened to know a stove setter in Sioux Falls who might be willing to travel for a fee. Torgrim refused. "You cannot sell what keeps children alive," he said. He said it to Pike's face in Pike's own store, in front of customers who had heard Pike call his chimney corpse cold 3 days earlier. The words were quiet and they were final. Pike's face did not change. He was a man who had learned to absorb refusal the way a ledger absorbs a loss, recorded, noted, carried forward to a future reckoning. He did not argue. He said, "Then I will report you to the land office as unfit. A man who destroys a stove and builds an unregulated fire structure in a wooden cabin with children present is a man the government should know about." "Report what you like," Torgrim said. "The land office is in Yankton and the road is under snow." This was true. Pike's threat was empty for the winter, and both of them knew it. But threats that are empty in November can become solid in April, and Pike was a patient man. Oddmund Brecke returned 4 days after the storm broke. His wagon carried less lime than it had when he left. The church chimney had needed most of it, but he carried something else, a narrow mason's trowel worn thin at the tip, which he had used for 20 years and which he placed on Torgrim's table without comment. "The church chimney draws," he said. "Your heater draws. I've had a productive week." He looked at the bench and ran his hand along its surface. He checked the clean outdoors. He opened the lower door and peered inside with a candle, examining the turn and the soot deposits in the channel. "The bench channel needs to be smoother," he said. "You have rough joints where the clay squeezed out during construction, ash catches on the ridges. Within a month, those ridges become dams, and the dams choke the draft." "I cannot reach the inside of the bench," Torgrim said. "You can reach it from the clean-outs. Use a flat stick wrapped in wet cloth. Push it through and smooth the worst of the ridges. Do it once a week." It was a small correction. It was also the kind of correction that separated a heater that worked for a month from a heater that worked for a winter. Oddmund delivered it without emphasis, because the information did not need emphasis. It needed doing. He found Torgrim teaching. Arne Tveit was in the cabin, studying the throat, asking questions about draft and temperature, and the point at which smoke ignited. Oddmund watched the exchange with the expression of a man watching a tool he made being used by someone else. Not possessive, not critical, but attentive. "You are teaching them the fire," Oddmund said after Arne left. "Who teaches them the maintenance?" "I do." "Then teach them the maintenance first. A man who knows how to light a heater and does not know how to clean it will kill his family in January. The fire is the easy part. The cleaning is the survival." Torgrim had not thought of it that way. He had been teaching the way he had learned: fire first, stone second, draft and bypass, and the roar of secondary combustion. These were the dramatic elements, the things that made the heater seem miraculous. Maintenance was not miraculous. Maintenance was a wire brush and a flat stick and a bucket of ash and the tedious weekly work of keeping passages clear. "My father never taught me the cleaning," Torgrim said. "Your father had a stove someone else maintained. You do not. You are the builder and the operator and the teacher, and if you teach the fire without the ash, you are building death traps." It was the closest they came to a disagreement, and it was not really a disagreement. It was a correction delivered with the bluntness of a man who had spent 40 years setting stoves and had seen what happened when maintenance was treated as optional. Oddmund was not angry. He was precise. And Torgrim heard him. From that day forward, Every teaching began with the clean outdoors: open, inspect, scrape, close, then light. Odman's cough had worsened. The church chimney work had required him to spend hours in wet cold, his hands in lime mortar, his face near open flues where soot and cold air mixed. The cough came from deep in his chest, the sound of something loose and heavy that moved when he breathed but would not leave when he exhaled. He did not mention it. Torgrim heard it. They worked together on Beret's heater. The second build went faster because they knew the mistakes, the soft joints, the lime in the mortar, the bypass, the clean outdoors. Beret's cabin was smaller than Torgrim's, which meant a shorter bench but a tighter throat. Odman adjusted the dimensions. The throat dropped to 6 inches by 6 inches. The bench ran 5 feet instead of 8. The chimney connection used Beret's existing pipe, which was sound. Beret worked beside them. She carried stone. She mixed mortar. She did not ask permission, and she did not wait for instruction. When she did not understand something, she said so. When she understood, she did it. Odman watched her set a course of firebrick and said, "You have hands for this." "I have hands for everything," Beret said. "That is what widows learn." The heater fired on the second day. Odman warmed the flue, opened the bypass, lit the kindling, waited for the roar. Beret watched every step. Then he made her do it herself. She warmed the flue. She opened the bypass. She lit the kindling. The fire caught. The throat roared. She closed the bypass slowly, feeling the draft build through the bench channel. And when the smoke cleared and the stones began to warm, she stood in her own cabin with her hand on her own bench and closed her eyes. She was not crying. She was counting. 8 minutes per hay twist. That was the number she had lived with for 2 winters. 8 minutes of heat, then cold, then another twist, then cold again. An endless cycle that consumed her days and her straw supply and her patience and her sleep. The bench would not consume anything. The bench would hold. "Can I do this alone?" she asked. She was not asking Torgrim. She was asking Odman, because Odman was the mason, and Beret was the kind of woman who asks the person most likely to tell her the truth. "Can you warm a flue?" "Yes." "Can you open a bypass?" "Yes." "Can you clean a channel with a stick and a wire?" "Yes." "Then you can do it alone." Beret became the practical test. If she could operate the heater without Torgrim or Odman present, if she could light it, maintain it, clean it, and trust it, then the method belonged to the settlement, not to Torgrim. It was no longer one man's survival, it was shared knowledge. She operated it alone for a week. She reported to Torgrim every 3rd day how long the stone held, where ash accumulated, what sounds the draft made when the wind shifted. She found that the wind reversal trick, the lower clean-out open to create the pressure pocket, worked in her cabin as it had in Torgrim's. She found that dry cottonwood, while inferior to oak, still produced enough heat to warm the bench when split small and burned hot. She found that twisted flax straw, which had been her only fuel for desperate nights, worked as kindling to warm the flue before the main fire. The hay twists she had burned 8 minutes at a time now served a different purpose. They were not fuel, they were starters. The difference was the difference between a life spent feeding a fire and a life spent lighting one. Torgrim taught flame color. "Yellow means waste," he told Arne Tveit and Halvor Espeland, standing beside his own throat with a burning stick. "The smoke is heavy with unburned gas. The throat is not hot enough." He adjusted the stick. The flame changed, the yellow faded, and a blue edge appeared, thin and sharp, curling around the base of the flame like a second skin. Blue means the gas is burning. The throat is working. That blue edge is your fuel burning twice. Oddman taught children to listen for bad draft. He sat Marte and Kittel and Beret's boy beside the heater and made them close their eyes. "What do you hear?" he asked. Marte said she heard the fire. Kittel said he heard the stones. Beret's boy said he heard wind. "The wind is wrong," Oddman said. "Wind inside the heater means the draft is pulling too hard, or the clean-out is open. The sound you want is the hum, low and steady, like someone singing with their mouth closed. When the hum changes, when it rises or drops or stops, something has shifted. Open the clean-out and look." Beret taught women how to dry fuel under the bench. She showed them the space between the bench and the wall, where radiant heat from the stones created a warm zone perfect for drying damp kindling and twisted straw. "Never closer than a hand's width," she said, demonstrating with her palm. "Heat dries. Too much heat burns. If you can hold your hand there and count to 10, the wood can sit there. If you cannot, it is too close." These were the small lessons that kept people alive, not the dramatic fire in the throat or the roar of secondary combustion, but the daily practice of maintenance and caution that turned a dangerous innovation into a reliable tool. Oddman's cough worsened through November. He refused a bed in Torgrim's cabin, sleeping in his wagon even as the temperature dropped, insisting that the cabin air was for the children and that he had slept in colder places. He worked each day, finishing Beret's heater, helping Torgrim draw plans for Halvor's, correcting the schoolhouse stove setter who had inquired about a smaller version for the building. One evening, after the others had gone and the children were asleep on the bench, Oddman sat by the throat and watched the coals die. The light from the firebrick throat painted his face in orange and shadow, and for the first time Torgrim saw how thin Oddman had become. The enormous hands looked larger because the wrists had narrowed. The coat hung differently. "You should rest," Torgrim said. "I should finish," Oddman said. "The schoolhouse heater is not safe. The box stove they have will kill someone before Christmas if the pipe clogs again. I want to see it right before I leave." "Where are you going?" "My brother's wife has a farm near Worthington. I will winter there. My knee will not survive another month on your floor." It was the first time Oddman had admitted that his body was failing him. He said it without self-pity, the way a man reports weather. This is what is happening. This is what it means. Torgrim heard the cough underneath the words, and he understood that Oddman was not leaving because of his knee. He was leaving because he was sick, and he did not want to be sick in someone else's cabin, where the sickness would become someone else's burden. Before leaving, Oddman gave Torgrim the narrow trowel. It was worn almost to a blade at the tip, the handle darkened with 20 years of lime and sweat and use. He did not make a speech. He set it on the table beside the clean-out door and said, "You know the turn now." Torgrim held the trowel. It weighed almost nothing. It was the lightest thing anyone had ever given him, and the heaviest. Oddman climbed onto his wagon at dawn. The sky was clear for the first time in weeks, a hard blue that meant the cold was deepening, not lifting. His horse stamped and blew vapor. Kittel stood at the step and watched. "Will he come back?" Kittel asked after the wagon had passed the fence line. "I do not know," Torgrim said. He hung the trowel above the clean-out door, where the warmth from the bench kept the iron from rusting. It stayed there. Some things are not tools and are not decorations. They are the shape of what someone taught you, hanging where you can see it every day. The schoolhouse crisis came 10 days later. A church school gathering, services followed by lessons, the way the settlement combined religion and education into a single weekly event, brought 14 children and 6 adults into the schoolhouse on a Sunday morning when the sky was steel gray and the wind carried ice crystals that stung exposed skin. The schoolhouse was a frame building, 20 by 30 feet, heated by a large cast-iron box stove with a 10-inch pipe that ran through the ceiling and out the ridge. The stove had not been cleaned since September. The pipe joint at the ceiling had loosened during the October storm, and no one had tightened it because no one had noticed. The creosote inside the pipe was thick, a dark terry coating that narrowed the flue diameter by 2 inches on every side. The teacher, a young woman named Christy Solheim, lit the stove at 8 in the morning and fed it cottonwood splits until the room warmed. By 10, with 14 children breathing and 6 adults crowding the space, the air grew heavy. By 11, the stove was glowing at the seams, and the pipe joint at the ceiling was leaking smoke, thin wisps at first, then a steady stream that collected under the ridgepole and sank toward the children. Christy opened the door. Cold air rushed in. The children nearest the door shivered. The children farthest from the door coughed. The stove consumed wood faster with the door open, the draft pulling hard, the fire roaring. At noon, the pipe joint glowed red, not the dull red of warm iron, the bright red of iron approaching failure. Creosote inside the pipe had ignited. Someone screamed. It might have been a child. It might have been the pipe itself. The sound of burning creosote inside a metal tube sounds like a scream, a high rising wail that carries through walls and enters the chest and stays there. Moses Bell was in the schoolhouse. He had been sitting in the back pew, half listening to the sermon, when the pipe screamed. He stood and looked at the ceiling and saw the joint glowing, and he said, in a voice that was calm only because panic would have killed children, "Everyone out, now." The children moved. Some of them ran. Some of them froze. Christy gathered the smallest ones and pushed them toward the door. Moses counted heads. 14 in, 14 out. 6 adults in, 6 adults out. The schoolhouse emptied in 3 minutes. They stood in the snow and watched the pipe. The glow faded as the creosote burned itself out. The building did not catch fire, but the pipe was damaged. The joint had warped from the heat, and the seal between pipe sections had failed. The stove could not be relit safely. The pipe needed replacing, and there was no replacement pipe in the settlement. Moses looked at the group. 20 people standing in the snow, the temperature dropping, the nearest warm buildings more than a mile away for most of them, the road between here and there crossed by drifts and wind. He sent for Torgrim. Kittle ran the 1.5 miles on foot, through drifts that reached his chest in places because he was 9 and light and could cross the snow crust that would have broken under a man's weight. He arrived at the cabin panting, his face white with cold, and said 3 words, "School stove broke." Torgrim did not ask for details. He took his tools, the trowel Oddmund had given him, a bucket of pre-mixed clay mortar, a wire brush, and as many firebrick as he could carry on the hand sled, and he walked to the schoolhouse. He arrived to find 20 people standing in the cold and a building with a dead stove and a damaged pipe. He looked at the pipe. He looked at the stove. He looked at the building. He could not build a full heater in one afternoon. The schoolhouse was too large, the materials too few, and the time non-existent. But he could do what Oddmund had taught him, not the grand solution, but the immediate one, the principle, applied to the emergency. He climbed inside the building and examined the stove. The cast-iron box was intact. The firebox was sound. The problem was the pipe. The joint had warped and the creosote had narrowed the flue. The stove was sending heat and smoke and unburned gas straight up a clogged pipe. And when the gas ignited in the creosote, the pipe became a chimney fire. The solution was not a new pipe. The solution was a baffle. Torgrim built a firebrick baffle inside the stovepipe path, a short wall of brick, 8 inches high, placed between the stove's exhaust outlet and the pipe entrance. The baffle forced the hot gases to turn before entering the pipe, a miniature version of the heater's turn, creating a secondary combustion zone where unburned gas could ignite before reaching the creosote in the pipe. Behind the baffle, he packed a clay-sealed secondary chamber, a small box of firebrick and mortar, 2 feet long, that the exhaust had to pass through before reaching the pipe. The chamber absorbed heat and slowed the gas, cooling it before it contacted the creosote. The result was exhaust that entered the pipe at a lower temperature, less likely to ignite the deposits, and a stove that burned cleaner because the baffle created the conditions for the smoke to burn. He also scraped the accessible section of pipe with the wire brush, removing what creosote he could reach, and he retightened the joint with a shim cut from sheet iron. It took 3 hours. The children waited in Moses Bell's wagon, covered with blankets. The adults took turns warming themselves by walking and standing in the wind. Beret arrived with a kettle of hot water she had carried from her cabin, and she poured tin cups for the children while Torgrim worked. If this story reminds you that the difference between danger and safety is sometimes one person who understood what others missed, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because what Torgrim built in that schoolhouse was not just a baffle. It was proof that knowledge shared is a knowledge that saves. When the stove relit, it drew cleanly. The baffle worked. The smoke entered the pipe at a temperature low enough that the remaining creosote did not ignite. The schoolhouse warmed slowly, not with the sharp, fast heat of the old full-draft burn, but with a steadier warmth that did not peak and fade. It was not a heater. It was a compromise, a temporary solution applied with permanent principles. But it kept 20 people warm through the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, and no one coughed, and the pipe did not scream, and the children slept on the pews without waking. Moses Bell watched the whole thing. He had sent for Torgrim because he had no one else to send for, and because the man who had been wrong about the smoke was now the only man in the settlement who understood why the smoke mattered. Moses did not enjoy this position. He was 58 years old, and he had spent 30 years earning the authority that came with experience. And watching a 31-year-old immigrant solve a problem that Moses could not solve was not comfortable. But comfort was not the standard. Warm children were the standard, and the children were warm. "You did this without the old man," Moses said, standing beside the baffle after the families had settled. "Oddmund taught me the principle," Torgrim said. "The principle works in any stove, the turn, the heat before the pipe, the cleaning. Can you teach me?" Torgrim looked at Moses, the former army teamster, the road overseer, the man who had told him that Dakota was heated with cords and not tricks, the man who had tried to send his children away, the man who had come back to check on them twice, because burying settlers was something Moses Bell did, and he did not want to do it again. "I can teach you," Torgrim said. That evening, while the schoolhouse stove burned with its new baffle and the children slept, and the adults talked in low voices about what they had seen, Pike's store caught fire. Not the store, the chimney. Pike had been burning coal at maximum rate since the October storm, damping the stove at night to conserve fuel and opening it in the morning to blast the cold out. The cycle had coated his chimney with creosote thicker than anything in the schoolhouse, a 1/4 inch of tar that had hardened and cracked and built up in layers like bark on a tree. The morning after the schoolhouse crisis, Pike opened his stove damper to full and fed it a double load of coal. The chimney caught. The fire burned itself out before it reached the roof. Pike had enough sense to close the damper and starve it, but the pipe warped in 3 places and the seams opened, and the store filled with smoke thick enough to choke. Pike's customers fled. Pike stood behind his counter with a wet rag over his face and watched his authority burn with his creosote. He did not come to Torgrim that day, or the next. On the 3rd day, He appeared at Torgrim's cabin with a cracked stove plate in his hands and an expression that looked like it had been carried uphill. "I will pay," Pike said. Torgrim looked at the stove plate. He looked at Pike. He looked at the man who had cut his credit, who had called his chimney corpse cold, who had offered to buy his design for the price of a flour debt, who had threatened to report him to the land office. "You will carry brick," Torgrim said. Pike carried brick. He did not carry it well. He was a man who had spent 20 years behind a counter, lifting flour sacks and coin boxes, and the firebrick weighed 7 pounds each, and the lime kiln was 2 miles through drifts that had refrozen into a crust hard enough to walk on, but treacherous enough to break through without warning. Pike broke through on his second trip. He went into his hip, and the brick he was carrying on the hand sled shifted, and 2 pieces cracked against each other, and one split along a fault line that made it useless for anything but fill. Torgrim, walking ahead, heard the crash and turned. "Leave the broken one," he said. "Bring the rest." Pike pulled himself out of the drift. His trousers were soaked. His face was red, not from cold, but from the particular flush of a man performing labor he considers beneath him in front of people who know it. Arne Tveit was behind Pike on the trail, carrying his own load, and Arne said nothing, which was worse than anything he could have said. Pike carried brick for 3 days. He did not speak while he carried. He did not speak while Torgrim and Moses, who had learned the foundation work and was now competent enough to lay a stone pad without supervision, built the base of Pike's store heater. He watched. He listened. He fetched water for the mortar mix and sand from the creek bank, and he did these things with the rigid efficiency of a man paying a debt in a currency he had not chosen. The store heater was the largest build yet. Pike's store was 30 feet long and 18 wide, with a high ceiling that ate heat and walls that leaked it. The cast-iron stove Pike had used was enormous, a 100-pound beast that consumed coal by the bucketful, but it heated the space the way a bonfire heats a field, intensely at the center, not at all at the edges. Customers sitting near the stove sweated. Customers near the walls shivered. The distribution was violent and uneven, which was, Torgrim realized, a fair description of most things Pike controlled. The store heater needed a longer bench, 12 feet, running along the back wall, and a larger throat to accommodate the coal Pike insisted on burning. Torgrim resisted the coal. Coal burned dirtier than wood, produced more creosote in the channels, and required more frequent cleaning. But Pike had coal, and Pike had paid for coal, and Pike was not going to stop burning coal because a Norwegian immigrant told him to. "Then we build the clean-outs larger," Torgrim said, "and you clean them twice as often." "How often is twice as often?" "Every 4 days instead of every 8. Pike's expression suggested that cleaning a flue channel every 4 days was beneath the dignity of a merchant. Torgrim's expression suggested that Pike's dignity was not a factor in the physics of combustion. "Every 4 days, Torgrim repeated, "or the store fills with smoke, and your customers leave, and your coal becomes your problem instead of theirs." Pike cleaned every 4 days. He complained about it. He complained about the ash and the soot and the wire brush and the flat stick wrapped in wet cloth. But he cleaned, because the alternative was the thing that had already happened, the screaming pipe, the warped joints, the smoke, the customers running for the door. Pike was a man who learned from consequences, even if he could not learn from advice. The store heater fired on the 4th day of construction. Torgrim warmed the flue. Moses opened the bypass. Pike, who had been told to stay back and watch, stood near the door with his arms crossed. The kindling caught. The throat roared. The bypass closed. And the 12-foot bench along the back wall began to warm, inch by inch, stone by stone, until the customers who had returned to the store that morning found themselves sitting on a warm surface that did not burn them and did not fade, and did not require them to crowd around a cast iron box that smoked when the wind shifted. A woman whose name Torgrim did not know sat on the bench with her infant and said, "It is like sitting on a hearth." Pike heard this. He said nothing. But he did not charge the woman for the half-pound of sugar she had come to buy, and that, for Pike, was a conversion more eloquent than any words. The settlement changed. Not quickly, settlements do not change quickly, any more than stone heats quickly but steadily. The way a practice becomes a habit becomes a way of life. By December, 5 cabins had versions of the heater. Torgrim's original, with its 8-foot bench and its charcoal time marks on the wall. Beret's improved model, with the shorter bench and the wider clean outdoors and a small warming shelf near the throat that she used for rising bread. Moses Bell's corner heater, a compact version built into the angle of 2 walls, with a bench that doubled as a sleeping platform for his nephew Gideon, whose frostbitten ear had healed but whose fear of cold had not. The schoolhouse emergency conversion, which was not a full heater but which kept the pipe from screaming. And Pike's store heater, oversized and overcleaned, and grudgingly maintained by a man who would never love it, but who would never again burn his chimney down. Each version had a chalk mark near the door. 4 words, "Warm flue first." The mark was Beret's idea. She had seen Halvor Espeland's wife try to light without preheating the flue, and the smoke that filled the cabin had sent the children outside coughing while the mother stood in the haze with the same expression every person wore when the heater smoked. The expression of someone who has trusted something new and is watching it fail. Beret walked to the Espeland cabin that afternoon and drew the chalk mark on the door frame with her own hand. She did not ask permission. She wrote it in English because English was the language the children read, and the children were the ones who would remember. Warm flue first, it spread. Within a week, every heater cabin had the mark. It was not decorative. It was not a motto. It was the single instruction that separated a warm morning from a smoky one, and Beret treated it with the seriousness of a woman who had counted hay twists 8 minutes at a time and never wanted to count them again. Torgrim and Beret worked together through December. This was not courtship. This was labor. They hauled clay from the creek in the same bucket. They mixed mortar at the same board. They argued about throat dimensions. Beret believed 6 inches was too narrow for families with children, because children drop things into openings, and a 6-inch throat was exactly the size of a child's arm. Torgrim agreed after Beret described, with the specificity of a mother, what a burn inside a firebrick throat would do to a 7-year-old's hand. 7 inches minimum, Beret said, and a grate across the top that a child's fingers cannot fit through. A grate will restrict the feed. Then build the feed from the side, not the top. The child cannot reach a side port. Torgrim looked at her. She was right. The side feed port was an improvement he had not considered because he had been thinking about fire and not about the hands that lived near it. He built the side port on Halvor's heater, and it became standard. Every subsequent build used a side-loading door instead of a top-loading chamber, and the safety record of the settlement's heaters reflected a design choice made by a woman whose primary engineering credential was that she had raised children near hot things and knew what they reached for. They argued about other things. Beret insisted that every widow and new immigrant receive instructions in language they could understand, not Torgrim's Norwegian shorthand, not Oddmund's Mason's vocabulary, but plain sentences in English that a person who had never built anything could follow. She sat at Torgrim's table and translated his notes, asking Moses for English words when her own vocabulary failed. The instructions were simple. First, open the bypass. Second, warm the flue with a burning twist. Third, light small dry kindling in the throat. Wait for the low hum. Fourth, close the bypass slowly. Feel for warm air at the far cleanout. Fifth, Load one large billet or several small splits. Let the fire burn hot, do not damp it. 6th, when the fire dies, the stone holds. Do not relight until the stone cools. 7th, clean the channels every 8 days. Every 4 days if burning coal. 7 steps. Beret wrote them on a board and hung the board beside the chalk mark at Torgrim's door. Women copied them. Men copied them. The instructions traveled the way useful things travel in small communities, hand to hand, cabin to cabin, each copy slightly different in handwriting but identical in content. The courtship happened inside the work. It happened when Beret corrected Torgrim's unsafe shortcut. He had begun skipping the flue preheat on warm days, trusting the residual heat in the chimney, and she told him, in front of Moses and Arnie, that the man who taught others to warm the flue had better warm it himself, or she would chalk his own door with a warning twice the size. It happened when Torgrim carried a load of firebrick to Beret's step and found her teaching Marte to mix mortar, 2 parts clay, 1 part sand, half part ash, a fistful of lime, and Marte's hands were gray to the wrists, and her face was bright with the concentration of a child learning something that matters. It happened when Beret's wagon began appearing outside Torgrim's cabin more often than not, and then always. And then the question of whether it would appear stopped being a question and became a fact, the way warmth in the bench was a fact, present, reliable, needing no explanation. They did not discuss it. They did not announce it. One day in February, during a thaw that softened the snow enough to make the road passable, Beret moved her belongings into Torgrim's cabin, and her boy moved with her, and Kittel shifted to make room on the bench, and Marte gave up the warm spot near the throat without being asked. And the cabin that had held 3 now held 5, and the heater, which had been built to save 3 lives, warmed 5 without complaint. Moses Bell presided over the marriage in March, not because he was ordained, but because the pastor was in Sioux Falls, and the thaw would not last, and Beret said she was not waiting for a man in a collar when a man with a badge would do. The ceremony lasted 4 minutes. Torgrim gave Beret a ring he had forged from a piece of the original cast-iron stove. The stove he had destroyed to build the heater. The iron was rough and dark, and it fit her finger like something that had always been there, waiting to be shaped into what it was supposed to become. Spring came late that year. The hard winter of 1880 to 81 held the prairie under snow until April, and even then the thaw was grudging, a few degrees at a time, the drifts shrinking over weeks rather than days. The creek opened in stages, ice cracking and shifting, and finally releasing the water that had been locked since October. Torgrim heard the creek from his cabin, a sound he had forgotten existed, and he stood in the doorway and listened to it the way a man listens to a voice he thought he had lost. He proved up the claim that summer. The land office in Yankton accepted his documentation, 5 years of continuous residence, the required improvements, the cabin and the well, and the fencing. The clerk who processed the filing noted the improvements as 1 frame cabin with sod chinking and 1 masonry heating installation of unusual construction. Torgrim did not correct the description. Unusual was close enough. The heaters continued. Torgrim built 3 more that second autumn, 1 for a new immigrant family from Trondheim who arrived with less than Torgrim had started with, 1 for a widow named Barbro Flatten, whose husband had died in the October storm, and 1 for the settlement school, which replaced the emergency baffle with a full masonry heater that Torgrim and Moses built together over 4 days, while the children watched from the pews. Moses had learned, not the way Oddmund had known, not with the instinct of a man born to stonework, but with the competence of a man who had decided that this particular knowledge was worth having, and had practiced it until his hands could do what his mind understood. He laid brick cleanly. He mixed mortar to the right consistency. He could warm a flue and open a bypass and close it by feel, listening for the hum that meant the draft had caught. He could not build a throat from scratch. That required Torgrim's eye for proportion, an Oddman's sense of how brick and fire and air interacted, but he could build a bench and a channel and a clean-out, and he could teach others to maintain what Torgrim built. This was the spreading. Not one man's knowledge multiplied, but one man's knowledge divided, broken into pieces small enough for different hands to hold. Torgrim built throats and turns. Moses built benches and channels. Beret taught maintenance and operation and the 7 steps. Arnetveit hauled brick. Halvor Espeland supplied fieldstone. Pike grudgingly stocked lime and clay tools and firebrick at the store, selling them at cost because Beret had informed him publicly that profiting from the thing that kept children alive would be remembered longer than the profit. Pike's conversion was not warm. It was geological, a slow, grinding shift from opposition to compliance to participation, driven not by a change of heart, but by a change of circumstance. His store heater worked. His customers sat on the warm bench and stayed longer and bought more. His chimney no longer screamed. His coal bill dropped because the heater's efficiency meant less fuel for more heat, and Pike understood efficiency the way he understood everything, as a number on a ledger that moved in the right direction. He did not thank Torgrim. He did not apologize for the credit cut-off or the threats or the offer to buy the design. He carried brick when asked, and he cleaned his channels every 4 days, and he sold lime at cost, and these acts were his conversion, not a confession of error, but a sustained practice of correction, performed without comment, visible to everyone, as durable and undemonstrative as the stone bench that warmed his store. One evening in late autumn of the 2nd year, Torgrim sat beside the heater with Beret and watched the coals die. The children were asleep, Marte on the bench, Kittel on a pallet near the wall, Beret's boy between them. The cabin was warm. The wind outside was not. Oddman's brother's wife sent a letter, Beret said. She held the paper near the clean-out door, where the light from the firebrick throat was enough to read by. He died in February, pneumonia. She says he was working on a chimney until 3 days before the end. Torgrim did not speak. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the trowel hanging above the clean-out door, the narrow trowel worn thin at the tip, darkened by 20 years of work that had ended in a farmhouse near Worthington while the hard winter pressed against the windows. Oddmund had not come back. Torgrim had known he would not come back. The cough had told him, and the thinness had told him, and the way Oddmund had given the trowel, not as a loan, not as a gift, but as a transfer, the way a man gives away a thing he knows he will not need again. He had died working. He had died near a chimney. He had died doing the thing he had done since he was 13, and there was nothing to say about that except that the chimneys he had touched drew better than the ones he had not, and the heater that warmed Torgrim's children existed because a man with a bad knee and a loaded wagon had heard laughter in a store and walked toward it instead of away. Beret put her hand on Torgrim's arm. The fire was out. The bench was warm. The children breathed in the dark. Some lives leave behind buildings. Some leave behind names on documents or money in accounts. Oddmund Brecke left behind a narrow trowel and the knowledge of the turn, the place where smoke reversed and heat stayed, and a settlement full of people who warmed their flues before lighting because a man with a cough had taught them that the fire was the easy part and the ash was survival. By the end of the second winter, 9 cabins had heaters. The original 5 plus Barbro Flattens, the Trondheim families, the full schoolhouse installation, and a 10th under construction for a family that had arrived in November with nothing but a wagon and a story about a place where the stoves did not smoke. They had heard about the settlement from a freighter who had stopped at Pike's store and sat on the warm bench and asked how the stone got warm with no fire burning. Pike had explained it, not well, not with Torgrim's precision or Beret's clarity, but with the blunt efficiency of a man who understood function, if not theory. The freighter had carried the information east and south, and the family had come. Torgrim never patented the heater. He was asked not by Pike, who had learned, but by a man from Sioux Falls who dealt in stove patents and saw opportunity in a design that could be manufactured and sold. Torgrim refused. He did not refuse because he was noble. He refused because the thing he had built was not a product. It was an answer. You did not sell answers to questions that Cold asked everyone. His drawing circulated. The charcoal sketch on the flour sack was copied onto boards, onto paper, onto the backs of seed catalogs. Beret's 7-step instructions traveled with the drawings. The dimensions varied. Throats ranged from 6 to 8 inches, benches from 5 to 14 feet, but the principles held: narrow and hot, the turn, the mass, the clean-out, warm flew first. Marte grew up knowing the smell of clay mortar. It was the smell of the cabin, and the smell of her father's hands, and the smell of the bench where she had slept through a fever while the storm outside tried to get in. She could mix mortar by the time she was 9, 2 parts clay, 1 part sand, half part ash, a fistful of lime, and she could warm a flue and open a bypass and listen for the hum. She could not yet build a throat, but Torgrim did not push. The throat would come when her hands were ready. Kittle became a mason's apprentice at 14, walking to Sioux Falls with a letter from Torgrim and the narrow trowel in his belt, not Odmund's trowel, which stayed on the wall, but a new one that Torgrim had bought at Pike's store with money earned from a heater he had built for the county school. Kittle laid his first independent firebrick throat at 16. His first heater, built for a family in Brookings County, burned clean on the first firing. He sent a letter home that said only, "The roar came right. I did not need the bypass." Torgrim read the letter at the table beside the clean-out door, beneath the trowel. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in the tin box where he kept the filed claim papers and Ragna's wedding ring and a single cottonwood leaf that Marte had pressed in a book the autumn before the fever. Years compress the way years do when the dramatic part is over and the living part begins. The cabin grew, in addition to the south, a proper root cellar, a lean-to for tools. The heater was rebuilt once, after the original clay mortar finally cracked beyond patching in the 6th winter, and Torgrim used the rebuilding to widen the bench and add a second warming shelf that Beret used for drying herbs. The tar paper on the north wall was replaced with board and sod, and then the sod was replaced with proper clapboard from the Sioux Falls mill, and the cabin stopped being a survival structure and became a home. Berat bore a daughter in the 3rd year, a girl they named Sigri, who grew up crawling on the warm bench and who fell asleep every night to the sound of the hum in the channel, which was, her parents told her, the house breathing. Moses Bell retired from road overseeing in 1886. His nephew Gideon took over the route. Moses spent his last winters sitting on the bench he had helped build in the cabin he had once told Torgrim to abandon, drinking coffee from a tin cup that stayed warm because the bench kept it warm, telling stories about the October storm and the hard winter to children who had not been born yet, and who listened with the wide eyes of people hearing about a cold they could not imagine. Torgrim grew older beside the bench. His hair went gray. His hands, which had split and bled and healed and split again during the first construction, thickened with calluses that never fully softened. He continued building heaters into his 50s, slower, with more help, with Moses' son learning the bench work, and Arne Tveit's boy learning the foundation. And when his back told him the brick hauling was finished, he sat at the table and drew diagrams for younger men who carried the fire brick and mixed the mortar and laid the courses while Torgrim watched from his chair and said, "Smooth the joint, smooth it. The ash catches on the ridge." Visitors to the cabin in later years noticed two things. The first was the trowel above the clean out door, narrow, worn almost to a blade, darkened with use that had ended in a farmhouse near Worthington when the hard winter was still pressing against the windows. The second was the warmth. The heater had been rebuilt and repaired and patched so many times that almost nothing original remained. The firebrick had been replaced course by course, the bench stones reset, the clean outdoors refitted, the chimney relined. But the warmth was the same. The bench held heat the way it had always held heat, patiently, steadily, without complaint. And the cabin that had once been a 12 by 16 box of boards and tar paper and desperation was the warmest building in the settlement. In old age, at a gathering at the schoolhouse, Torgrim heard a young man repeat Moses Bell's words. The young man was telling a story, the way stories are told in settlements, around a stove, in winter, when the dark comes early and the talk fills the space the light leaves behind. He was telling the story of the first winter, the dismantled stove, the firebrick, the storm. He had the details approximately right. He had the spirit exactly right. And when he reached the part where Moses visited the cabin and saw the woodpile, the young man said, in an imitation of Moses's flat delivery, "You cannot heat Dakota with a trick. You heat it with cords." The room laughed. Moses, who was sitting on the bench with his coffee, laughed too. The laugh of a man who has lived long enough to hear his own worst moment become a joke, and to understand that the joke is also a compliment because no one remembers the words of a man who is not worth quoting. Torgrim did not laugh. He smiled. It was a different thing. The smile was for the young man, and for Moses, and for the room, and for the bench they sat on, and for the trowel hanging in his cabin 3 miles away, and for a 9-year-old boy standing in a house in Telemark, watching a candle flame bend sideways in a draught he could not see. By the next winter, the settlement no longer judged warmth by chimney smoke alone. Several cabins still burned ordinary stoves. Some families preferred the familiar, and some could not afford the brick. But the poorest families, the ones with the least wood and the thinnest walls, copied Torgrim's firebrick throat and stone bench, because those were the families for whom the math mattered most. 1 cord stretched to 3. One evening's fire held through the night. One detail carried the spread more than any other. Children walking past chimneys after first light, looking not for black smoke rising from the cap, but for frost melting around the rim, the sign that heat was moving through stone below, invisible and patient, doing its work without waste. Torgrim remained on the claim he had nearly lost. He grew older beside the same north wall bench, patched and rebuilt more than once, its surface smoothed by years of hands and blankets, and sleeping children and warm cups set down and picked up and set down again. In later years, visitors to the cabin saw Oddman Brecka's narrow trowel hanging above the clean-out door, the iron kept clean by warmth that rose from the bench and would not let it rust. When they asked about the trowel, Torgrim said only that it had belonged to the man who taught him the turn. He did not explain what the turn was. He did not need to. Every heater in the settlement had one. No smoke above the cabin. Snow driven flat against the door. Neighbors certain the family inside had died. Moses Bell, frost in his beard, pressing his ear to the boards and hearing a child cough, the sound of life in a place where silence was expected. He had said it himself, standing in that cabin a week before, counting billets and cottonwood chunks and dismissing everything he saw. "You cannot heat Dakota with a trick, Vangen. You heat it with cords." But inside the cabin the fire was out, and Marte slept under quilts on a bench of fieldstone and clay, and the water pail had only a skin of ice, and Torgrim Vangen's hand rested against warm stone long after the flame was gone, the way his father's hand had rested against warm tile in a house in Telemark, in a country he had left, and a winter he had carried with him, the memory that had saved his children's lives. That winter, the smoke disappeared, and that was how they knew the fire was finally staying inside.